The psychological sex addict. Okay, this is someone, and again, there's research now. I remember even going back to the early '80s, which I think it was Golden Valley was the treatment center for sex addiction back then, and they were talking about 80 to 90 to 70%, 70, 80, 90% were either emotionally abused in their family, and I would also say neglected. They experienced emotional pain from their parents. I'm believing that was about 90%. 80% were sexually abused, and that research pretty much stays pretty stable. So when you're looking at sexual addiction, there's an 80% chance you're looking at sexual abuse, which we're going to talk about in a separate category because it operates differently. Um, the uh, the physical abuse from a parent is also high with the psychological sex act. Now, there is a slight variance here. When I'm dealing with someone who has these kind of issues, abandonment, they were adopted, they were neglected, they were physically, emotionally abused, and we'll leave sexual abuse as a side category for a moment, then oftentimes what can happen, and this we'll get into this as we do the intake form, is their fantasy life or their pornography selection will somehow counterbalance the psychological deficit. So if they feel that they have no control, they might actually prefer pornography or fantasy where they're dominant. Okay. And so there are some times where the psychological deficits, if you will, can help you as a counselor. Of course, you have to go back and work through that, but it can help you to understand and help them understand why they're choosing certain things, certain behaviors, and to understand what's going to maybe trigger them differently than someone who doesn't have that. Like a biological sex act isn't going to be triggered necessarily by their spouse rejecting them or having a bad day or their boss being mad at them. Okay. But a psychological sex act could easily be triggered emotionally because the emotional needs is what they originally found could get met in a fantasy state. Because now remember, because some of you haven't had a sexual fantasy state, so I gotta, understand that I'm not talking to a group of sex acts who go, "Oh yeah, I get you, Dr. Weiss." Okay. But when they go into the fantasy state, they are worshipped, they are adored, they are all important, they are all powerful. People say and do what they want them to do, as long as they want them to do it. It's all about them being serviced. It's not about connection and mutuality. It's very much a place where they get their psychological needs met. I mean, it's like they go into this virtual world, which we didn't have even the language when I started counseling, but they go into this fantasy virtual world that they can create the characters to say and do as they wish and to meet some deep longings in their psychology or in what I would call the heart. And if their heart needs to be nurtured, then the man or woman in the fantasy is saying those kinds of things. If they're going to repeat some kind of shame or stuff like that, then they're being maybe possibly it's a violent theme towards them. So the psychological type of sex act is meeting not just the biological release, but the psychological. And I can tell you the psychological withdrawals of not having what I call boo-boo mommy can be just as painful as the physiological withdrawals of not having the release, the chemical release to ease your life past, present, that you have grown up with this binky medicating that. And so as the person heals, this will be important for them to address as they go through. And I'm going to try to see I'm trying to keep track of questions and I don't see anything. Okay, so on the psychological, so you have the biological and psychological, and many are both. And probably in the 80% category, you're going to see both of these show up. Now, let's go ahead and go to the third. This one's really easy because this one's rarely going to show up in your office, but it's real. And history and also my clinical experience and the clinical experience of others bear this one out. But this is the person who will rarely come to your office. This is the spiritual-based sex addict. They have a spiritual vacuum, and almost every religion records people who are great in their movement. Okay, it doesn't matter what the religious movement is, that once this person had that spiritual encounter, be it Jesus, be it in the Jewish faith or Hindu faith or any kind of faith, even a New Age faith, they have this spiritual awakening and their search for God was in their sexual addiction. They were looking for that unconditional love, that unconditional connection, that value that comes from being loved. And they were looking for something bigger than them to believe in. And because that was the very root of why they were using the sexual behavior and the sexual addiction, oftentimes it is eradicated at the moment that they have a genuine spiritual encounter. And when they do, they tend to join that particular group of people, and they tend to go down that road. And so this isn't someone who will necessarily come into your office, but this will be someone who you might meet here and there. I've met a few of them who they had an encounter and they were done. But I have worked with pastors, rabbis, medicine men, spiritual leaders of every category you can imagine, rabbis who were completely sexually addicted. And you're like, well, how can that be, Dr. Weiss? How can they be so spiritually mature and be a sex addict? Well, because they're one of the other 5 types. They're the biological, they're the psychological, they're the ones we're going to get into in the next few moments. And so because they have those issues, for them, the sex addiction wasn't filling the spiritual hole. In my own personal awakening, I was an alcoholic and drug addict. When I had my spiritual awakening, that was gone instantaneously. I haven't had a drink in 40 years plus, okay, or any illegal drugs. But my sex addiction stayed because my sex addiction wasn't rooted in spirituality. It was rooted in trauma and the psychological stuff. And I had to heal, not just have that hole filled. And so you might find these periodically, or someone might say they have this, and that's a fine thing for them to have that encounter. And if they're staying free, that's awesome. And they probably won't come for counseling or go to 12-step groups or many things we're going to talk about today.